day. Thank you for joining us on your lunch period here. And we have a good group here. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me. So this is Heather with the New England Museum Association. You can just type in the chat feature where you're dialing in from. That would be awesome. Oh, that's great. Everybody's saying hi to me. I always like that. Great. So now that you're used to using the chat feature, that's actually how you're going to be asking Dan questions. So if you have any questions at all during his presentation, feel free to type those in, and I will be relaying that question on to him, which would be awesome. Okay, and I also want to let you know that today's session is being recorded like other Lunch with NEMA. So if you ever miss a Lunch with NEMA or have to leave early, go ahead over to our NEMA website, and under the Lunch with NEMA you can find prior lunches, and this one will be up later on this afternoon. So to get the ball rolling, I'm going to turn it over to Dan to talk about perfecting your elevator speech just in time for the NEMA conference in October.
Thanks, Everett. And welcome, everybody. Glad to be here. I assume you can hear me okay. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today, and I've done the elevator speech session a couple of times over the last few years, and it's something I never get tired of doing, mainly because it's such an important aspect, I think, of being a museum professional, and that accompanied by a little bit of networking we're going to talk about today will really get you in shape for the upcoming NEMA conference, and which, by the way, I hope everybody's registered for. And if you haven't, go to nemanet.org as soon as you can and get yourself signed up. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let me just see if my clicker is working here. Nope. Got to do that. Heather, how am I advancing? There we go. Guess I'll just do it manually. So as a skilled museum professional, it is absolutely essential for you to have one or more elevator speeches ready for just about any occasion, and not necessarily on an elevator either. It's critical that you're able to tell your story effectively in 1 minute or less. Now, in theory, this is the amount of time you have to impress somebody who's gotten onto the proverbial elevator, gotten on with you at the ground floor, and is riding to the top. The elevator speech is your verbal calling card, so to speak. It's used in both casual situations like networking events and the like, and in more formal situations as well, like job interviews or visits with donors or other VIPs. And the like. So to create the perfect elevator speech, you really need to hone all of your experience and accomplishments and aspirations and put those into a concise mini presentation, as I call it. And then you need to memorize that mini presentation so you can draw it out of the recesses of your mind whenever the situation warrants. Your goal is to create an extremely positive first impression, showing people that you've got confidence and poise so that people remember you and remember your message as well. Now, a good elevator speech makes others recognize you as a confident leader, able to articulate your museum's mission, for example, respected for your knowledge and an ability to inspire people. So spending a few minutes with us here today will help you not at just NEMA events, but perhaps benefit you in the long term as well over the course of your career. So how many of us have walked into a crowded room at a NEMA conference or wherever and felt absolutely positively terrified about talking to people? Well, it happens to everybody at least once, but having an elevator speech in your head gives you the confidence to go out there and break the ice. So we have a lot of ideas to cover, and let's get going on it. Our agenda for the next few minutes looks something like this. I'm going to first go over some elevator speech basics that I've learned during the course of my career. Then we'll touch on the importance of preparation, how to prepare your speech, how to organize the content of your elevator speech, and then I'll give you some tips on how to master the delivery of your elevator speech. And we'll finish up the session by going over a few networking tips that when combined with your newfound expertise at delivering an elevator speech that will help you make the most of the NEMA conference and other conferences and other occasions throughout your career. All right? But before we get rolling, let me give you one of my own elevator speeches. As the director of the New England Museum Association, I have to say that I feel as though I've arrived at my dream job. Our organization currently enhances the lives and the missions of about 3,000 museums and museum professionals throughout the 6 New England states, which for a museum fanatic like me is absolutely a perfect job. Before joining NEMA, I was the director of the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation in Waltham, Massachusetts. And prior to that experience, I operated Yaeger Communications, which was a marketing communications firm specializing in destination planning and development, which means that I worked with cities and towns and regions around the United States and internationally to bring visitors to their doors. And it was in that context that I found myself working with a number of museums as clients, including the MFA here in Boston, the Peabody Essex Museum, Cleveland Museum of Art, Mariners Museum of Virginia, and several others. So it was in that context, at the intersection of culture and private enterprise, that I came to understand really how important it is to develop a good elevator speech and public speaking in general. So let's get started with some elevator speech basics. And first, I want to point out that a good elevator speech really isn't a speech at all. It's an elevator conversation. Your goal isn't to educate your listener when you're giving an elevator speech. Your goal is to really kind of engage him or her. And the best way to do that isn't to deliver just a soliloquy about yourself. This is generally very boring to people. It's not very impressive. So instead, you need to really have some extremely compelling phrases and stories locked away in your memory that you can draw out appropriately to give your listener information about you while making the whole thing appear very natural and interesting and conversational. So the best elevator speeches are give and get, as it's known. You're hopefully giving your listener a very positive impression while at the same time you're getting information or assistance from your listener. So that very important concept of it being an elevator conversation. Now that, of course, means that the key to giving a good elevator speech is flexibility. In fact, you should realize that you can't have just one elevator speech. You need to have many, one ready to meet just about any situation you might encounter. Well, how many of those do you need, you might ask? Well, you need one, of course, to introduce yourself. You need one, perhaps, to advocate for your organization if you're at the State House or the Capitol or in, Town Hall, whatever. You need one for job hunting or career growth. You might need one for each of your volunteer or extracurricular interests, and so on and so forth. You get the picture. It seems, though, like this might be a lot of work, but the good news is that you can mix and match these elevator speeches for the right occasion. So as you can guess, you have to be ready to ad-lib in your elevator situation. And the key to successful ad-libbing is to break your elevator speech down into manageable chunks, into sort of modules or sound bites, as it were, and insert or remove those sound bites as the situation warrants. So how much time do you have to deliver your elevator speech? Well, that depends on the situation, too. It depends on how much time you have to keep your audience interested in what you're saying. The general rule of thumb, as I mentioned earlier, is 1 minute at most. Most elevator speeches, you're encouraged to get it all done in 1 minute. But that's sort of like taking the elevator all the way to the top floor. Sometimes your listeners may be going only to the 10th floor, so you only have 30 seconds. So you need to be prepared and be flexible. And the last thing I want to address in terms of our elevator speech basics is the fear that some people have of feeling sort of phony when they deliver a bunch of memorized information to a stranger, sort of like delivering a sales pitch. And, I would say it is phony if you deliver it like a hard sell, if you're only talking about yourself. You probably have listened to this, people just yammering on and on and on about, what they do and so on and so forth. But you really, it's phony if you do it like that. It's the best ones are conversations. So you need to be aware of your listener and find a way to relate to them. And if you do that, you'll be really impressive. So I'm going to move on to preparation and remind you, if you have any questions as we're moving forward, make sure you put them in the chat window. Heather, you can interrupt me, and take those questions, and I'll do my best to answer them as we move forward. So, preparation. How many times have you observed really great speakers? You know the ones I'm talking about. You know, they're the ones that sound very natural, such an easy delivery. You think they must be making it up as they go along, that they're speaking off the cuff, right? Well, let me dispel that myth right now. The reality is most speakers are obsessive about preparation if they're any good. They really work hard to make their elevator speeches look very natural. So for them it's practice, practice, practice. As Mark Twain once said, it usually takes me 3 weeks to prepare a good impromptu speech. And I think there's a lesson in that. You really do need to prepare to make it look natural and off the cuff. Now you've heard the famous Thomas Edison quotation that success is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, right? Well, I believe that success in speaking is 1% inspiration and 99% preparation. It's the key to a smooth final presentation, no matter what type of presentation you're giving, whether it's a keynote speech or an elevator speech or whatever. So think of your elevator speech as an iceberg. The presentation itself is just the tip, the only part that's exposed to view, but the most substantial part of the presentation is what's seen only by the presenter, the preparation that goes into a successful elevator speech. So let me spend a couple of minutes on the main elements of preparation. To be inspiring with your elevator speech, you really do need to find your own inspiration. So get yourself energized by watching really great presenters. Observe people you admire while they're speaking in staff meetings maybe, or networking events, or during formal presentations. Try to pick out the elements of their speech that makes you sit up and take notice, their words, their timing, their tone of voice, and so forth. If you know them at all, ask them how they do it. People really love talking about things they do well, and they love helping somebody out, especially public speakers. They really take pride in it and in mentoring people. TED Talks are another great inspiration. Everybody knows TED.com, I hope. Now, although the people there are not really delivering elevator speeches, TED speakers are really usually very high-end, blue-ribbon folks, and they can provide you with a lot to emulate. So go find your inspiration as you're thinking about doing an elevator speech. Second thing is try to know your audience as much as possible. Try to anticipate this. Now, it's very important to tailor your elevator speech to fit with whom you're speaking. As I said earlier, you need to have an elevator speech for every occasion, right? So if you're looking for a job and you're going to be hobnobbing with a group of museum leaders, say at the NEMA conference, your elevator speech for that occasion will be very different from the one you deliver when you're speaking, say, to the mayor of your town about the importance of your museum's education programs or whatever, right? So think carefully about your audience as you're preparing your elevator speech. Spend a little introspective time as you prepare as well. If you know you'll be attending an important event like the NEMA conference, start thinking about what you're going to be saying at least a few weeks beforehand. Gather your thoughts by scribbling them on a piece of scrap paper or sticky notes or whatever to get started. Or one of the things that I do is I sometimes use a special notebook, or I use an app called Evernote. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. OneNote, one of those things. So you can keep your ideas together on your smartphone or what have you. Then the fun part begins, which is actually writing. So you convert these rough notes containing things you might want to go over, but make those then into a detailed script, literally something that that you can actually read and so forth. Refine it, polish it so that it flows well, and make sure you're thinking about your time constraints. Keep it under a minute ideally. And then the last step here is to rehearse. You want to memorize that script so that you know it backwards, forwards, and sideways, whatever. That way you'll be able to ad-lib as needed without ever being at a loss for words. Now, ideally, you'll practice in a nice quiet room where you won't feel self-conscious because everybody feels weird practicing a speech. Use a stopwatch or the stopwatch feature on your phone to make sure that it's nice and short. Sometimes it's really nice to practice in front of a mirror. You can practice gestures and expressions and sort of train yourself not to have your hands moving wildly, that type of thing. So again, rehearse. Very, very important. And we're going to move on to content. Heather, any questions that I need to address?
There are a couple questions coming up, but I think I'm going to wait a minute because I think you're going to address them, but it's something that it's come up a couple times, so we will wait for a minute before we ask them.
Okay, fine. You've heard this before, haven't you?
Yeah.
All right, so content. I'm going to give you top 10 tips for developing the content of your elevator speech. And the first one is to keep it simple. So your elevator speech should seek to deliver a handful of memorable, sticky ideas, I call them, right, that your listener will remember forever. These key ideas or sticky ideas, they stick to the person's memory. They're the framework around which you organize your elevator speech. So ideally, your elevator speech isn't going to have any more than, say, one or two key ideas. Any more than that, and your listener's eyes will kind of glaze over. So you have to ask yourself, what do I most want the listener to remember about me? So formulate those key sticky ideas before you do anything. Second, make sure you're telling what's unique about you and what you do. So perhaps you don't just work in a museum. Everybody works in a museum, right? But you think about phrases that you use. What do you actually do there? You're the audience engagement specialist, say, and what does the museum do? They use a lot of virtual reality technology or something like that to create memorable visitor experiences, whatever. So think about the things that are particularly unique to what it is that you do. Third, you have to make it exciting. You have to create a presentation that quickens your pulse first and foremost. So if you're excited, the listener will be too. Make sure you think about putting some energy into not just the delivery, but also the words. And I said it before, and I'll say it again, you have to think of your audience. The best elevator speeches achieve what I call a harmonic resonance between you and the listener, a balance between what it is that you're saying and what the interests that you have in talking to a person and the person that you're talking with, what their interests are as well. So this isn't going to happen if your elevator speech is a sales pitch or a one-sided show and tell kind of a thing. You really have to be thinking about your audience and what they want to hear from you. For this reason, you really need to, again, make that elevator speech conversational. In addition to memorizing your speech, you should probably have a few questions handy that you can use to draw your listener into a conversation. So you talk a little bit about yourself, and then you say, what do you do, and so on and so forth. And that really creates a much more memorable and lasting impact because the person's going to be attracted to you as a person that's interested in them. Think about telling your story as a story, actually. We're all storytellers here in the museum field, but when you use personal anecdotes, for example, it really enlivens your message. So it's not just, what you do. It's like, here's the experience that I had. So, for example, there I was, stuck in an epic traffic jam on I-95 in Boston when it came to me, the idea for an automobile exhibition that was the largest event in our museum's history, something like that. So you're telling a story about you're in a traffic jam, and what do you know, an idea came to me. Incorporating your story into your elevator speech makes you very relatable and interesting, so people will want to know more about you. Use very powerful, evocative language that has lots of impact. This is what makes those sticky ideas stick. So, for example, you don't just love art, you live for art. Your museum's programming doesn't educate kids, it inspires them to aspire, or something like that. So you get the idea. Now, in this context, judicious use of facts and figures can be powerful as well. When you use facts and figures, it can convey your authority and credibility. So there's a big difference in saying something like our museum served a lot of school children last year, like ho-hum, big deal. But you actually say something like, we served more than 2,500 children, 22% of them of whom had special needs, that type of thing. So that really enhances your credibility. You're giving people actual facts and figures, so that has a lot of impact as well. Structure your speech with this simple pattern: who, what, and why. Communicate who you are, what you do, and why the listener should care. Who, what, and why. Who you are, what you do, and why the listener should care about those things. Make sure your elevator speech has a clear call to action as well, an indication of what you'd like the listener to do. So if your objective is to be hired at the listener's company, the place where that person works, the museum or whatever, ask how to submit a resume. If your objective is to be introduced to someone that your listener knows, go ahead and ask that. If you simply want to stay in touch, say that too. Most people are quite willing to help someone out if asked the right way, but really it's amazing how few people actually ask for what it is that they want when they're giving, say, their elevator speech. They're at a networking event. It's almost like they're too bashful. They don't want to be imposing. But people really do like to help you out, and you have to be very clear about that. So a call to action is very important to insert into the elevator speech. And last but not least, make sure your elevator speech evolves. You're going to give this elevator speech, time and time again throughout your career. So you want to gain practice and get feedback from your listeners. And you can tell this by, body language or what people are responding to. What a great story. That's interesting, they might say. So you know that you've resonated with them. So pay real attention, though, to their body language and what they're saying to you, so that you can develop new phrases, new content, new ideas based on your listener's reaction. You might think of another story, for example, that illustrates what it is that you're doing, or a better story, that type of thing. So make sure your elevator speech evolves and you're not just locked into doing the same old thing all the time. Okay, let's move on to delivery. And I guess I would say, with practice, your elevator speech will really become second nature to you, right? It should be anyway. It'll be fluid and it'll be natural, and people will be impressed with how off the cuff it seems, just like Mark Twain, right? But the first time or so, the first few times you deliver your elevator speech, you might have butterflies in your stomach. It's very nerve-wracking sometimes. So here are a few ways to get those butterflies under control. And the first thing I want to say is that hopefully, again, you've remembered to rehearse like crazy. The more you master your elevator speech by rehearsing it, the more relaxed you become, because you're very familiar with it. You're not going to trip over your words, that type of thing. Before you begin, it's sometimes helpful to visualize yourself giving the perfect elevator speech, right? So before you go into the room at a networking event, say, spend a minute or two just sort of visualizing yourself being cool and confident and giving your elevator speech to people, walking up to them and smiling and so on and so forth. And when you do that, you really do relax yourself quite a bit. You're reminding yourself not to be nervous. I just mentioned to smile. Remember to smile. Try to have fun with it. Get caught up in the moment. When you smile, it loosens you up and actually makes you more sympathetic to your listener. So try to have fun with it. And one thing that you might not, but okay, we in? Can people hear me? How's that? Yay! Dan is back. Well, I just plopped myself down in Meg's seat using her headphones. So, wait, lost both of you now. Uh-oh. Times when you are talking with Okay, keep at it. All right, great. Well, hopefully this will work out. Sorry about that, everybody. So I was talking about slowing down, making sure you get rid of the butterflies by speaking clearly. And one thing to remember also is that sometimes taking, remembering to take a breath, remembering to breathe, taking a sip of your water or your drink or whatever the case might be at a networking event is really a good technique. Just kind of remember that you need to enunciate. Okay, so let's see if I can control things here. Hold on a second. Okay. There we go. So another important aspect of delivering your elevator speech is body language. Now, you've surely heard the adage, it's not what you say, but how you say it, right? Well, body language is a universal language, and mastering its use will help you not only communicate a message, but also establish an impression. So, for example, did this guy that you're looking at here, did he just hit or miss the field goal, right? I mean, you can tell. Nah, he missed it by a mile. Look at that body language, right? He's slumped over. How about this guy? What kind of body language does he have, right? Very obvious. He's kind of a cantankerous vice president, former vice president. And how about this guy, right? He communicates cool and calm and being somewhat suave and so forth. So body language is very important. Here are a few things that you need to be aware of when you give your elevator speech. The first thing, eye contact. Eye contact is, to me, the most important type of body language. And your mother probably nagged you about this as a teenager, right? But you know something? Your mama was right. When you establish eye contact as you speak, you're doing really all sorts of things. You're asserting your confidence, you're showing your concentration, you're exhibiting respect for the person you're speaking with. Conversely, when you fail to make eye contact, you appear distracted and uninterested and potentially disrespectful. Of course, the trick is to maintain just the right of intensity of eye contact without freaking people out, right? So too much makes you look a little creepy, looking way too frequently makes you look a little shifty. So be aware of how you're making eye contact. Like everything, it's a question of balance. Handshakes. Handshakes are probably the second most important element of body language to get right, especially if you're making a good first impression at a networking event or wherever. So if you have too soft a handshake, people think you're kind of wimpy, right? And too hard, people think you're on steroids. So most literature on the subject recommends that you really have just a firm grip, a simple pump of the arm, and you're good to go. Politicians, they're always slapping backs, and but the guy you see in the picture here, it's a great technique. Putting your hand on the other person's arm as you're shaking hands really does emit this very great sense of warmth and closeness to somebody. So again, first impressions, this is a great way to do it. Speaking of hands, where do you put them when you're giving your elevator speech? Hand control is really very important. Now, you should use your hands to emphasize important points, but try not to gesture too much or you're going to come off somewhat threatening. When you're not gesturing, you're going to want to just keep your hands in a neutral position if you can. If you're seated, keep them folded on your lap or on the table, and if you're standing, hold them together in the ready position, I call it, which is something that you have both hands kind of together, fingertips together, perhaps, kind of elbows bent. That indicates that you're open to your listeners' comments. When you're standing there with your arms folded, it tends to make people think you're kind of standoffish somewhat. And a lot of people are doing that quite a bit. A lot of times you put your hands in your pockets and it looks like you're maybe not paying attention, perhaps, whatever. The worst of all, of course, is adopting the penalty kick stance that you see here, which too many people use as their default position. So make sure you sort of are aware of where your hands are. And that's why practicing in front of the mirror sometimes helps out quite a bit. You're able to see like what you naturally do with those hands. And last bit of body language is make sure that you respect personal space while you're talking. You want to be able to be close enough to the person, of course, to be able to have a meaningful conversation so that you're heard, and the like, but you don't want to be so close that you know the other person is backing up and whatever. If you see somebody backing up, you know you're just a little bit too close into their space. And of course, that's like, I guess the trick is modulation. When you're in a noisy networking event, you end up, you know, yelling a lot. You tend to be a little closer, but you do want to sort of make sure that you've given that person enough space that they can feel comfortable about it. So, where do you usually deliver your elevator speech? Well, it's usually not on an elevator. Your elevator speech really does come in handy at professional networking events first and foremost. So let's spend a few minutes talking about how to master the fine art of networking. Now, I'm going to say this right up front. Networking has kind of a bad reputation sometimes, especially in the museum field. A lot of people see it as kind of this phony, contrived thing where everybody's on the make, sort of like a singles bar, you know, throwing those elevator speeches around. Some people would rather get a root canal, frankly, than go to a networking event. They're absolutely terrified of walking up to total strangers and introducing themselves. They have a fear of rejection, perhaps, or of appearing idiotic. So some people then believe that networking is kind of an optional thing. It's a nice to have skill, but instead of a must have. But as I said at the very beginning, it's really, really important that you take networking seriously, because it's absolutely the key to advancing your career. Now, in reality, networking can really be fun and productive if you're in the right frame of mind and follow some basic strategies. So here are a few things that I normally coach people when I'm talking about networking events. The first thing is that networking is not about selling yourself to an unwilling buyer. Sort of like we talked about with the whole point of an elevator speech, you're not giving a hard sell. Instead, it's really about cultivating relationships. Relationships that are mutually beneficial, and they might last just a couple of minutes, you know, just that networking event, that short conversation. You may never see that person again, but they may develop into long-lasting professional friendships that really totally transform your career and your life in many ways. And I can't tell you how many people that I've met at networking events, and they have become my support system, my mentors, you know, so on and so forth. So go into it thinking that you're going to develop a terrific relationship, and that'll put you at ease, I think, a lot easily. I think many people mistakenly believe that networking is about, you know, sort of taking from people, or, you know, giving information to people, you know, as, again, that sales job. But actually, networking is really about giving and getting. You're giving something of yourself, your expertise, your story, your talents, perhaps, and in return, you're getting knowledge and advice and contacts and support and so forth from this other person. So giving and getting is a great way of looking at it. Second, you have to, you have to learn that anybody can be a good networker. Not long ago, I read this great book. It's called Networking for People Who Hate Networking. So look that up. Google Networking for People Who Hate Networking. It's really an interesting book. And it made the case that anybody can master the fine art of networking, whether they're introverts or extroverts, or something they call centroverts. It's a category that I learned, and I thought that I like that. I consider myself a centrovert now in many ways. One of my favorite networking resources is this terrific schematic diagram called How to Work a Room. It was created by a networking coach from Boston named Diane Darling. And yes, they do have such a thing, a networking coach. But take a look at it. It's you can get it, let's see, dianedarling.com. Or just Google how to work a room, and you'll find this pop up, and it's a great thing to get a good close look at. It's a step-by-step diagram of how you can effectively work a room without feeling very cheesy. So I really do recommend you download it and study it and put it to good use. I learned a whole bunch of tips. For example, a little bit more of a close-up here. So the whole story is that this person, Diane Darling, walks into this networking event, and she gives you strategies for actually breaking the ice with people. What's the best way to go talk to you know, one of the VIPs, you know, those types of things. One of the tips that I learned
that I have used ever since is the simple tip of putting your business cards in your one of your pockets. It's always designated for your business cards, and so I always put them in my left hand jacket pocket, blazer pocket if I'm wearing a sport coat. And so I always know where mine are, and then any incoming business cards that I receive from people I put in the right-hand pocket. That way I'm not mixing it up, because I've done that before where I'm actually handing somebody else's business card. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that you learn there. Diane Darling says that real leaders are curious and ask a lot of questions. So when you go into a networking event, you do ask a lot of questions. You need to have scripted phrases in the recesses of your mind, she says, but more important, you need to be adept at making conversational connections with your partner, listening to what they're saying and relating your own experience to theirs. So remember to ask questions. One skill that is an essential accompaniment to your elevator speech is the art of remembering people's names. So if you want to make a good impression, there's really nothing better. And I've worked hard on this over the course of time. This guy, Dale Carnegie, many of you I'm sure have heard of him, the author of How to Win Friends and Influence People. He said, a person's name is to him or her the sweetest and most important sound in any language. So when you remember someone's name, you're paying them the ultimate respect. You're really saying to them, you're important to me. And they in turn are drawn to you because you recognize them. And this is something that not everybody's very good at names. So if you really do learn how to memorize people's names, remember people's names, you're going to stand out from the crowd in a very positive light. So it's all about observation. And here are 4 basic steps to remember people's names forever and ever and ever. Okay? First, you have to make a commitment, a conscious decision to remember people's names. It sounds easy, right? But a lot of people they say, oh, well, I can't remember people's names. I have a bad memory. Well, forget about that. When you forget people's names, it's less of a product of a bad memory than a lack of commitment to actually remembering them. So whenever you go somewhere that you're going to meet people, networking event or, paying a visit to some, another museum or whatever, remind yourself that you absolutely will try to remember people's names. It's, all you have to do is flip the switch, so to speak. Yes, I will remember people's names as I enter this room. Second thing is you have to concentrate. When you meet somebody. So concentrate on paying attention to that person's name when they introduce themselves, and then form an impression of that person's physical characteristics to link their name with an image. Now, a lot of times, you're so busy meeting somebody and immediately thinking of what you're going to say to them that you forget about this whole name thing, and you forget about it. You forget their name quickly. So if you forget their name quickly, you just say, hey, I'm sorry, I missed your name again. Can I get it again? Would you mind even spelling it for me if it's a complex name? But really pay attention to when they say their name, you concentrate on it. Third, repeat their name during the subsequent conversation. When you repeat things, it engraves the name on your memory. So use the name immediately, and then say it perhaps silently to yourself, and then use it when leaving. So, for example, Jonathan here says, hi, my name's Jonathan. You say, hey, glad to meet you, Jonathan. And then at some point during the conversation, you say it again, hey, Jonathan, I'm wondering about XYZ. And then when you wrap it up, Jonathan, it was great to meet you. Hopefully we'll see each other again sometime. So you said it 3 times, and that engraves it on your memory. And finally, try to associate the person's name with their physical characteristics or some kind of other imagery. So when you meet Elizabeth, for example, she might remind you of Queen Elizabeth, right, on a throne. So you visualize, here's Queen Elizabeth on a throne, she's got a crown on, whatever. The next time you see that person, you're going to think of crown, robe, throne, whatever. Queen Elizabeth, right. So, it's kind of a silly little thing. Or if you meet a guy named Warren, he might remind you of Warren Buffett. So you picture him lighting a cigar with a, $100 bill or something like that. Or if you meet a Michelle, she might remind you of Michelle Obama, something. So you get the point. The point is really to spend a little energy forming these associations, and with time and practice, you will in fact be good at names. And the next time you see someone you remember, they're going to be all the more attuned to your elevator speech and forming a good impression of you. Your elevator speech defines who you are to someone who doesn't know you, and your goal is to make a positive first impression, right? And rightly or wrongly, people judge you based on your appearance. Your appearance contributes to whether your elevator speech is successful in making that positive first impression. So let me talk for a minute or so about dressing for success. Now, what you wear is very much a communication of your personality, and it sends signals about your professionalism. The museum field is a creative field, so the good news here is that there's some latitude about what constitutes appropriate dress in the workplace and in professional situation. There's a higher tolerance in the museum field than, say, banking or insurance or some other conservative fields, for how you wear jewelry or creative apparel, body art, tattoos, that type of thing. However, you have to be cognizant to the fact that you are typecast by some degree by your appearance. So you should really approach what you wear very carefully. Some people can carry off more interesting styles, for example, better than others, but you sometimes run certain risks. You might be perceived as not quite serious, or whatever, perhaps not as responsible if you're in a position of leadership. So you need to think about what it's communicating. You might be perceived as unrepresentative of your institution to the outside world, especially if you're dealing with conservative donors and funders. So you have to watch and make sure that what you're wearing kind of fits in with, again, that audience that you're talking with. In the end, though, I always tell people you really do need to wear what fits the best, not just from a tailoring standpoint, though that's important too, but from a psychological standpoint. You're most confident when you wear clothing that you feel best represents you, not what people, what you think people expect you to be. So confidence is the most important part of success in speaking and, in life. And so wearing what's comfortable for you is very important. The other thing is to remember that what to wear is also situational. So make sure you know or can guess what the dress code is for whatever event you're attending. And a great case in point of this is the NEMA conference. Now, normally, how people dress at the NEMA conference reflects their role in an organization, or maybe the role that they aspire to. Very often you find that directors and senior staff are, usually a little bit more buttoned up. They're dressed in suits and ties and, whatever. Creative types often dress down a bit or add a splash of counterculture to their wardrobe. But things change, right? This year's NEMA conference is on Cape Cod at a beach resort, so the dress code's going to be a little more business casual across the board. I don't plan to wear a tie, for example, throughout the conference, right? So if you're unsure about a dress code at an event, don't hesitate to contact the event organizer to see if they have some tips. When in doubt, though, I always advise folks to try to be the best dressed person in the room, relatively speaking. You'll always be remembered positively, and besides, you can always take off the jacket or tie or whatever, right? So be the best dressed if you're in doubt. So ultimately, your elevator speech contributes to your personal branding. Now, personal branding is a term that I sort of have mixed feelings about. As I said before, I've spent 20-something years as a marketing communications person, so I've developed a lot of branding platforms for companies and organizations as part of their marketing strategies. So I understand corporate branding, but personal branding, when I first kind of got used to that term, it sounded like, well, it's kind of smarmy, like you're packaging yourself to sell in the marketplace. It lacks a little bit of authenticity, that type of thing. But one thing I learned about branding is that you yourself can only influence your branding. It's up to others to define your brand in the way they perceive you. So you're going to have a personal brand whether you like it or not. And if you're not conscious of it and help to cultivate it a little bit, you're not going to like it for sure. Now, one of my friends is a guy named Greg Stevens of the American Alliance of Museums, and he teamed up with a few other folks on a book a few years ago, which I'd recommend to you. It's called A Life in Museums. Covers things like branding, personal branding, and networking, and those types of things. And he says in the book, your personal brand is a bridge, a two-way connection. On one side, it's how you communicate your strengths, skills, and passions in a distinctive, relevant, and consistent way. On the other side, it's how others perceive you and what you have to offer. Ultimately, it's a bridge between you and what people come to like, trust, remember, or value about you, and how you continue to learn about yourself and others, growing and strengthening relationships along the way. I thought that was a good quote, though, about personal branding being a bridge between you and others.
Hey, Dan, we're having a little trouble with hearing you again.
Uh-oh. Is it something I said? How's that? Any luck? Still there? Hello? Test, test.
Yep, Dan.
Okay.
Dan, I can hear you too.
All right, good.
So I think you're set. It's just it flips in and out sometimes.
Yep. Okay. Well, we're in the home stretch here anyway. So anyway, to me, personal branding is an outgrowth of emotional intelligence, which you have to be mindful in order to really have a good success at branding yourself. So in order to develop your brand, you need to reflect on your ideal self. What is your personal vision? What's your mission in life? Whom do you serve? What are your passions? Those kinds of things. So discovering your brand in this way is in fact very authentic because it puts you in touch with yourself. Ultimately, your elevator speech used in networking situation is how you deliver your personal brand to people. Done right, it reflects very positively on you. It helps people understand all the things that make you tick as an amazingly complex person, all in a simple and yet powerful 1-minute mini presentation, right? That's the challenge, and that's the fun. So there you go. That's all I got. Elevator speeches, networking, personal branding. Thanks for listening. So how about those questions?
Dan, can you hear me? This is Heather. I just want to make sure that I'm back on board.
Yep, I hear you.
Okay, so there was a question earlier, and I know you kind of briefly talked about it, but we're really good about talking about our job and what our museum does. Mm-hmm. How do we transition to talking about ourselves as maybe a potential employee? Instead of it's like we love our job, we love what we're doing. How do we talk about ourselves? Well,
I guess, first thing is to try to figure out what it is that you're actually, I said call to action, right? What is your call to action in the conversation? So are you, for example, thinking about moving on to another job? And, at what stage is that, for example? And so, if you're talking with somebody that can be helpful in that process, you might be thinking about, hey, by the way, I heard that, where you work has an opening for XYZ. And, I think that might be interesting to me because I have X, Y, and Z skills that I think might be very valuable to the organization. I think the big thing is to not be shy about communicating what it is that you can do to add value to a place, that, you're an engaging person, that you've got the skills that would, be perfect for this particular situation. And I think a lot of people are very shy, about talking about themselves because they probably have been victimized by people that do that, where they just talk about themselves constantly, and you don't want to be that kind of person. But when you do it in a way that is very, well, when you actually have thought about it and construct your elevator speech, you're actually figuring out ways very intentionally to be able to communicate that in a very tasteful way, the conversational way, that type of thing. And when you memorize the elevator speech, you've rehearsed it, you have practiced and whatever a few times on people, get their reactions, you can tell when you're hitting a home run with it, when people nod and so on and so forth. And the big thing, of course, is whatever it is in your career, your capabilities and skills are really, I read a statistic, it's usually like in the 45% range of importance to people that are hiring. The 50% part is the chemistry, the personal skills that you have with people. Those are the things that people really want to envision you as a terrific member of the team. And you can communicate that very quickly in an elevator speech because your personality comes out.
Okay, we just had two similar questions come up on that one. And then Dawn also brings up a really good point about culture. She had someone tell her that, she found it disrespectful to look her in the eye. So that's another thing I think that we also need to think about is, we do have different backgrounds culturally. And sometimes if, eye contact is a little bit weird too. Is there any other questions?
Interesting. Hey, well, no, one thing I would say is that I mentioned like the handshake and the touching business, and that also is, you do have to be sensitive to culture because, in some cultures, physical contact with people, and some Muslim societies, it's a big no-no, especially between unmarried men and women, that type of thing. So you have to be aware of that, and you also have to be aware of even if it's not in a foreign culture, but just the body language of the person with whom you're speaking. If some people just don't like to be touched, they've got a thing even about shaking hands, so you have to be sort of aware of that. Good point, Dawn.
Do we have any other questions? I know you guys are typing, and hopefully it's not because of the audio, but you guys actually have questions. How do you determine whether to use a first name?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is perhaps, it's situational for sure. It is maybe a question of, when in doubt, I said, when in doubt, be the best dressed person in the room. When in doubt, be more formal, and then that person can correct you. So when you say, Mr. Smith or Ms. Jones or whatever, oh, no, please call me Martha, or call me Jim, whatever the case might be. And then you have your cue at that point, like, oh, okay, fine. Now, it's interesting. I was talking to somebody about this just yesterday too, about the formal, whether you're calling this person Elizabeth or Beth, that type of thing. And again, sometimes it's fine to ask the person as well. Do you like to be called Elizabeth or Beth, or is that whatever? Sometimes also, if you're at a more formal networking event, at a conference or whatever, you've got a name tag, and that helps out a lot. You can certainly see it, and that helps you get a cue as well, whether you use first names or nicknames.
And then someone wanted to review the part under the content section when you mentioned who, what, and why. Can you review the why again?
Oh, that's easy. Why they care, or why should they care, right? So you have to make a case for yourself. Let's see if I can find it here. Ultimately, it's who you are, what you do, and why should that person care. So you actually have to, kind of give them, not literally say, here's why you should care, but, let them know how it is that you relate to them in whatever manner it is. And that might just come out in conversation or what, but let's see, here we go. Who, what, and why. So, the why is why should they care? And I'm seeing somebody saying, how do you handle situations where you're at the bottom of the social totem pole in the room? Well, there are all sorts of questions packed into that about why you consider yourself at the bottom of anything. But, certainly you do notice, if you're a newcomer to a, whatever it is, an association or a group of people, you think about like when you entered school, a new school, anybody that's, moved with their family and gone to a new school, that's tough. You got to break into situations that are uncomfortable. And I think that, folks that are new to, say a NEMA conference, your first time, first thing is that, by the way, like at the NEMA conference specifically, we have a session at the very, very beginning. I think it's, 8 o'clock, Heather, on Wednesday, newcomers, sort of a session on how to orient yourself to the conference and some tips and so forth. So that helps to identify with other people that are brand new. You kind of go together, you have wing people as your posse. You can go together into different things, and you can not be alone in those events, and that helps out sometimes. Sometimes it's also just having the courage, if you know that you see somebody that's, somebody you're just dying to meet, one of the speakers or some, person that's very renowned in the field, say, you just have to come up with the right approach.
I think that was just happenstance on the Joanna. So I think with Susan's question, That was actually a really good one on that one, because I've been in the same situation where you're in there with a bunch of donors.
Mm-hmm.
So I totally understand. And then also to back up Dan's question about the newcomers, we actually do have a newcomers handbook on the NEMA website. So if you're new to any of the sessions or to conference and stuff like that, we do have some icebreakers, how to prepare for the conference.
Also, take me up on that idea of downloading How to Work a Room, because Diane Darling gives you some really great tips on how and where to meet people. For example, the best place to very casually bump into people and start a conversation is in the line for food, for example, or the line for drinks, or whatever the case might be. So anyway, take a look at that, how to work a room. What else? I see Antonio here has a very detailed and complex question. Oh, can you hear me? Antonio, I'm reading your question here. It's a good one. Your words box you in. Yeah, you know, it's very true. I think that the only thing that I can say, Antonio, in terms of you know, what it is that you're saying, is that whole rehearsing thing gives you control over your conversation. You know, when you're able to actually develop an elevator speech, you are in control of those words. And sometimes when you're literally extemporaneous, you're, you know, making it up as you go along, you say the wrong thing and you think later, oh gee, why did I say that? That was really idiotic. Or, you know, I wonder if I gave the person the right impression of, you know, what I was trying to communicate, that type of thing. And when you actually intentionally create, you know, a script, and you find those right words and you memorize those words, those, you know, little sound bites that I was talking about, you have control over it. You feel a lot more confident because you know, at least from your vantage point, you're saying what you intend to say. Now, whether the other person is receiving it the way you intended is another question altogether, but you have a much better chance of making that match and hitting your mark when you rehearse. Good question and observation, though. Anne, been away from the museum field for a while and want to avoid sounding apologetic about that. Well, like, what do you have to be apologetic about? I think that, you know, the question is, people move in and out, people rotate around, and what have you been doing outside of the museum field that actually has some kind of bearing on what it is that you're talking with somebody about? It might be, you know, that you've been traveling for a while, or you might have had health issues, perhaps, that, you know, has kept you away, or a family, you know, you've started a family, you know, and now you're back in the job world, you know, that type of thing. Nothing to apologize ever. I mean, even if you were in prison for the last 5 years, I don't know, maybe you'd hide that a little bit. But, you know, I think that whatever it is that you've been doing, that's part of your story. And, you know, if you're conversational about it, I think that, you know, you can bring those things out and, you know, try to think of them as positive aspects of your life that perhaps somebody else might be interested in. I mean, for example, if you hear that that person loves to travel, you might say, oh, you know, one of the things I was doing over the last couple of years while I was, you know, away from the museum field is I've been doing a lot of travel. Here's where I've been. Here's what I've learned. Here's what I've discovered. Those, you know, again, it's a conversational thing. I wouldn't be apologetic about anything that you do in life. Who else? Anybody else? Okay. Well, I guess that's a wrap. Oh, wait. Any other questions? All right, I'm seeing thank you, thank you, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for being here with us today. Hopefully we're going to see you all at the conference. And what is it? It's exactly 4 weeks from today it starts, right? Wow. Heather, we better get busy. Yeah, really. All right. Well, anyway, we'll see you down at the Cape, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. Take care.